Hi students, welcome to Module 1 of ISM 7060. This is going to be a lecture to kind of pull all the pieces together of the readings that I required for this particular module. Disruptive technologies is one of my favorite things to teach. I actually teach an 11-week course on just disruption and diffusion. And so I'm trying to pull together kind of my favorite readings and the things that I think are most impactful so that you get a really good foundation for disruption and innovation, because it permeates through the rest of the course. Most of the things that we'll be talking about and reading about have to do with how innovations come into our world. So I couldn't figure out how to get the presentation to come up. I'm using OBS on a Mac here, and OBS is another innovation and a disruption. But it was kind of limiting this morning. So you're just going to look at me instead of me and what's on Canvas. So what I did was I kind of put these in an order. Your readings and everything are in an order to kind of build on your understanding of how diffusion and innovations work. So we start with Everett Rogers, who really goes back as the farthest that I can find regarding academic readings regarding innovations and diffusion. So he wrote Diffusion of Innovation. The first copy came out in 1965, and you think, my gosh, why are we using something so old? But the reason we are is because innovation just happens, and disruption takes place all the time. Goes back, forever, right? The wheel, that was a disruption. So I want you to understand that what's happening today is something that's been happening forever, and it's not just about technology and business. A lot of these things go back to things like agricultural innovations that are permeated through the land-grant colleges in the U.S., using the extension offices. I'm actually a master gardener in Michigan and Florida. So I participate in two different extension groups, and they are responsible for diffusing innovations that take place at the university and making sure that the community understands how these innovations work and why they're powerful, and how to use them to leverage, better ways of farming and gardening and things like that. So I've participated often in these types of diffusion exercises. Diffusion of Innovation by Everett Rogers. I've asked you guys to read 2 chapters, and if this is an area that you really like, I would encourage you to read the book. It's really a fantastic book that once you read it, you just kind of are able to internalize how innovations kind of pop up and how they are proliferated through the community, through the population. But these 2 chapters, I think, help us to understand the attributes of innovation. So what does an innovation have to have in order for it to proliferate through the population? And then innovativeness and adopter categories. So the types of people that help us to diffuse innovations throughout the community. So chapter 6, attributes of innovation, we'll just kind of go through this kind of, at a high level. Obviously the reading was much more significant in helping you to understand this. Relative advantage is the degree to which an innovation is perceived as being better than the idea it supersedes. So that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, why would we diffuse something that wasn't better than what we had before? The trick here is that, and you hear this in the Christensen video, the trick is that relative advantage is subjective, right? So if I'm part of the mainstream market, the new innovation typically comes in with less characteristics, less advancements than what the mainstream product currently has. And that's because it's aimed at typically a section of the population that are non-consumers. So like Christensen says in the video, right, he's talking about Toyota coming into the U.S. market. which is obviously a mainstream automotive market. And they didn't aim at the middle of the market, which would have been a sweet spot for the domestic OEMs like Chrysler and Ford and General Motors. They aimed at entry level cars. So cars that Christensen says are, appropriate for students, right? People who don't have any money. Now, why would Ford, GM, and Chrysler care about that market? They wouldn't, they're not making cars that market can afford. So there's no reason for them to be concerned about Toyota coming in and marketing to that particular population of, non-consumers, basically. So to the mainstream market, stripped down, really cheap Toyota isn't going to be appealing at all. But to people who can't afford a Ford, GM, or a Chrysler, it's very appealing. It's a very inexpensive car, and it gets people, off bikes or walking or buses or whatever it is that they're using to get to work. They can now use a car. So the relative advantage for somebody who's taking a bus every day is very high, but the relative advantage of a low-end Toyota to someone who's already driving a Ford Explorer or something like that is not there at all. They would say, my gosh, of course I don't want that low-end Toyota. I have this really fancy Ford Explorer. So relative advantage is subjective, and it's typically aimed at non-consumers or the very low end of the market, or just people who are doing something else. So another example, when digital cameras came out, they weren't aimed at professional photographers, because professional photographers had fancy, 35 millimeter cameras that worked great and had, terrific resolution. The first digital cameras came out were kind of fuzzy and, weren't anywhere near the photographic quality of the existing 35 millimeter. But they were aimed at casual photographers. So people like me who, as a mom, a young mom, trying to take a Christmas picture of my children, digital cameras changed my life, because I used to have to take, 24 or 36 pictures with a 35 millimeter camera, not having any idea at all whether I got a decent picture for my Christmas card. The digital cameras allowed me to see the picture, and whether it was high quality photographic, portrait quality or whatever, didn't matter to me. It was going on a card, it was going out to 100 people or whatever, and it didn't have to be a perfect picture. So I was part of the non-consumer, potentially a population where something besides perfect quality appealed to me. That ability to see and delete photos before I, got them developed. So they have different types of characteristics that appeal to a different audience, not an audience. The glare in my glasses is distracting me. It's aimed at a population where the characteristics of the new innovation are appealing, but the mainstream users, and that would be with digital cameras and 35 millimeter, would have been photographers, would have rejected it because it wasn't as good as what they were using before. So again, relative advantage is subjective, and it's typically aimed at non-consumers. So then the second characteristic is compatibility. So compatibility, again, is subjective. Is it the degree to which an innovation is presented as consistent with existing values, past experience, and needs of potential adopters? So again, if it's aimed at mainstream users, it's not necessarily going to be compatible. It's going to be something that's different. But if it's aimed at non-consumers, it's going to be something that's appealing. So it may take some training. So if we're talking about like a Toyota to people who've never driven a car or take a bus to work, it's going to be something that's going to require some training. You're going to have to take driver's ed, just like everybody else. But compatibility, again, has to be somewhat consistent with something that we're used to. So in order for it to be readily adopted, it's got to be something that, we feel is acceptable. The next characteristic is, I think it's complexity. That one's long. Complexity is next. So complexity is the degree to which it is innovation is perceived as relatively difficult to understand and use. So if something, like for instance, let's take a look, let's go back to the automotive market and let's look at electric cars, because this is part of the reading that I required for you guys. I actually wrote 2 articles for a software company that I do some freelance writing for. They're obviously short articles, as I'm sure you read. And we look at the diffusion of electric vehicles. So I've been looking at this for a while. It's a curiosity of mine to kind of see how EVs diffuse. I've had a Tesla for 4 years, so I was an innovator in this space. And to me, it's very interesting how these electric vehicles are diffusing. From a complexity perspective, they are slightly more complex than an existing internal combustion engine is. But at the same time, it is, simpler. EVs have far fewer moving parts. And so, there's no oil changes, there's no antifreeze, there's what are the other fluids that go into the internal combustion? There is windshield wiper fluid. I'm not actually sure if there's brake fluid. I've got like 53,000 miles on my Tesla, and I've never had a brake issue. It has what's called regenerative braking, where the car slows itself down, and you don't always have to use the brake like you do in an internal combustion engine. So in some ways, an EV is more complex, because one of the things that people get held up on is the range anxiety. So if you drive more than 250 miles in a day, you're going to have issues with range. If you drive like, normal people, and you drive maybe 50 miles in a day or even 100 miles in a day, you're going to be able to charge the car back up in your garage overnight. I have a 240 line in the garage, so it charges up at about 25 miles an hour. But it's something that you have to think about, and people get caught up in that. So the complexity of that, I think, has resulted in less diffusion of EVs, despite, advantages in environmental and cost. It's much less money to own an electric car. There's less maintenance. There's just less cost. I mean, I save, probably close to $2,000 a year in the cost of gas, because the car charges up and it charges overnight with less expensive electricity. So despite the advantages, it still isn't proliferating through the U.S. market, which is a mainstream market. The next characteristic is trialability, which is, can I try it out? So if we look again at EVs, you can try out an EV before you buy it. You can go and buy you can try out a domestic EV, like the Ford Mustang EV. You can go to a regular dealership. Tesla also has a location out in Clarkston, Michigan, where you can try out a Tesla before you buy it. So trialability is strong in this space, and it's something that is important in diffusing innovation. Observability is the degree to which the results of an innovation are visible to others. So observability is kind of about other people adopting an innovation, and you're able to see that. So in the case of an EV, depending on where you live and whether people in your community have adopted one, you may not see one. And so therefore you think, oh, no one's using these things. These are crazy. I'm not going to do it either. But the more that there is diffusion, the more you're likely to see an EV. And then you start to think, okay, so my brother has one or my neighbor has one. And you start to think, okay, maybe this is normal. Maybe I should think about an EV. So observability is an important aspect to people becoming more comfortable that I'm not the only one, I'm not the first one, they've worked the bugs out, things like that. And they help with diffusion. So I'm trying to keep these videos at a reasonable level. So I'm going to stop. This is the end of chapter 6, and we're going to talk about chapter 7 in the next video.